Welcome to another episode of TMI Tuesdays, the women's health podcast where nothing is off limits. I'm Lawren, your new favorite vagina, aka women's health physio, and I'm here to have honest, practical, and unfiltered conversations about women's health across every stage of life. If you enjoy this episode, I'd absolutely love it if you subscribed on Spotify and shared it with someone who might also benefit. Thanks for tuning in. Let's get started. Hello and welcome back to TMI Tuesdays. It's Lawren here, and I am joined today with another Lawren Fischer. This is part 2 of our 2-part episodes with Little Spuds Nutrition. So Lawren Fischer is a registered dietitian and the other co-founder of Little Spuds Nutrition. So we had Marilee Pumple on last week, Lauren's business partner, to chat about eating disorders and postpartum nutrition and neuroaffirming nutrition care. And so this week, we're going to chat with Lawren on supporting families and childhood nutrition. She specializes in pediatrics. She also works with prenatal and postpartum women and individuals through that period. But today, for the sake of this episode, we're going to dive into pediatrics and working with families and children. Even though this podcast is more geared towards women, we thought that this episode would actually be really relevant to most of our listeners because a lot of our listeners have young families and children. So thank you so much, Lawren. You are also a mom, and I know you bring both lived experience and clinical expertise to your work. So thanks so much for joining me today. And I'm so excited to dive into this conversation with you.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. So why don't you start off by sharing with our listeners a little bit about your background, your expertise. And I'd love to also share, we didn't get too much into this in Marilee's episode, but maybe what a registered dietitian is for those who might not know, and what some of the differences are between the care that you provide and maybe, a standard nutritionist.
Yeah, for sure. So my name is Lawren Fischer. I am a dietitian. I live in Victoria, BC. My background, I went to school at UBC to major in dietetics. And from there, I really started my career in clinical pediatrics, working at BC Children's Hospital and then Victoria General Hospital, primarily working in pediatrics and supporting kids with nutrition therapy, often in the context of like some sort of acute illness. So whether that was in the intensive care unit or during cancer treatment, where kids were having difficulty eating. And I was doing what we called medical nutrition therapy. And with that, I really learned a lot of great skills, but then also met so many families that also just wanted, like, how can I help feed my family? How can I build a good relationship with food? How do I do this? And I just met so many parents that were wanting a lot of trusted nutrition advice from a nutrition expert that knew pediatrics. And so that's what really inspired me to work along more in my private practice. Marilee and I both found that pediatrics and eating disorder care and neurodivergent affirming care is all kind of a continuum of care, of which we are serving people at just different periods of their life, a lot of like nurturing a healthy relationship with food. So that can really start at an early age with kids. And so that inspired us to work all together. And I really, really enjoy that field of work. I guess a lot of the questions are like, what does a dietitian do? Like, do you work directly with kids? Would I work with a 2-year-old? Probably not. So primarily as a dietitian, I primarily support parents. I'm working one-on-one with a lot of parents who are coming to me with either they're just not feeling confident, they've read so much information around a specific topic or have this understanding of like what their grandma's telling them and what their aunt's telling them, what their friends telling them and what Facebook's telling them on how to feed their kid. And they are like, I just need to hear it from someone that has a good objective lens on nutrition of how can I support my family. So I'll often work with parents on what I call a really thorough nutrition assessment, and I'll be getting all of the information of what goes into family eating for that person, who's doing the cooking, who's doing the cleaning, what time, where, when, how, what are we doing, who's grocery shopping, all the nitty gritty. If there's a specific, nutrition concern around a kid, I'll get information on their bowel movements, their sleep, their activity, their social cues. What kind of personality are they? Are they a really cautious kid? Are they a really outgoing kid? Are they a really cautious kid in the playground and then super cautious around trying vegetables? Are they super outgoing in every other context but don't want to try new food? I just find all of that super, super interesting. And what is temperament and the language that is how parents are describing meal times. If they're coming to me being like, mealtime is a battle, it is a war zone, it is just absolute turmoil, I'm like, okay, how can we flip the script on making mealtime not sound like the most dreaded part of your day and make it something that you can at least like get through and look forward with maybe some smiles, hopefully no tears. And so support really looks different for every single family. Sometimes it's giving a lot of information of being like, this is maybe what you've been told, but this is really what the evidence says. Or this is like, how can we make this mealtime really positive? Could that be something before mealtime, during mealtime, or after mealtime to make those transitions really positive for the family and not, those really scary, dreaded parts of your day? So yeah, support can just look so different. For dietitians, we could do what we call like medical nutrition therapy. So I might be making recommendations around specific supplements or vitamins or regimens around just based on someone's lab work, or being able to interpret some of those investigations and results, or even collaborating with physicians on asking for certain investigations and then providing evidence-based recommendations on that. Or I could be providing recommendations based on just like the input or the meal environment, the scheduling, just anything that can go along with having a successful mealtime with the family. And so oftentimes too is like we're giving a lot of like cheerleading and accountability. Like parenting and feeding kids are really, really hard. And sometimes you just need someone in your corner being like, you're doing the right thing. This is really hard and you can keep doing it. And so sometimes I'm just that cheerleader too. So I wear a whole lot of hats when it comes to nutrition, dietetics, and nutrition assessment, but it's honestly whatever a family needs for that support. Um,
Yeah, sounds less about the specific food itself and more about strategies and validation and creativity, I'm sure, as well, especially with pediatrics, being
Absolutely.
creative. And you're talking about the child's personality and those things as well. So I can imagine, yeah,
Totally.
every situation and every day is completely different. So that would be keeping you on your toes, I'm sure,
For
in your
sure.
day-to-day practice. Yeah.
Yeah, it's super
Yeah.
fun.
That's awesome. And so I know you mentioned a few examples already, but maybe we can dive into the top areas that you support parents and
Mhm.
families with their children's eating. Some families might just think, oh, this is just normal. And I know there's a range of normal, but they might not even realize that there's support for something like this. So, yeah, what would be a few things, the most common areas you work in that
Yeah.
might, if anyone's listening to this, they go, oh, that's actually something I can get help with?
Totally. Yeah, I would say the most common things, I'll go through probably like two or three of them, but one of the most common things and one thing that I really love working with families with is starting solids. So I think just in this like world and age of like social media, starting solids has just become this enormous conversation and maybe like polarizing topic that does not,
Mm.
that has gotten really, really almost overcomplicated, and very polarizing. Like there's a lot of people in this like very strong camp of like baby led weaning only or purees only, and it makes people really nervous. And so and just also really empathizing with a lot of like first time parents like in that postpartum phase of like you're really just trying to figure it out, and obviously you want to do the best thing that you can. And when starting solids, which is supposed to be like a fun and exciting time, gets really blown out of proportion. I really love just chatting through people of like building that confidence of like what makes sense for them. Like you do not need to put a title on the method, or I'm like quote unquote method of starting solids that you're doing. Is like what feels natural to you, what feels comfortable for you, and what makes sense for you and your family moving forward. And I'm there to kind of give you what does the evidence said and what are the things that we're looking for and what is sort of the purpose of starting solids at this age. And so I love just chatting through that topic. It's something that people are like so excited about and then are super nervous about. And so just trying to make it much, much less complicated and make it in a way that as a parent, you can feel like you can trust your gut again, because it really makes you sometimes like second guess what you're doing to see social media and have that comparison. Like, you see a kid holding a huge like corner cob and they're eating this like enormous plate, and your kid might like look at an avocado and take a lick of it and like throw it on the ground and not be excited and just, trying to be like, that's totally normal and part of the experience. I love just talking about that with people and just making it like realistic again and bring down that anxiety. Because if you are a parent and feeling really anxious and feeding it a kiddo, it's like they're going to really feed off that anxiety too. And that's not, a great healthy way to start your relationship with food. So if we can get off on the right foot, I love turning the tables around on that. Starting solids is a topic that I love chatting about with people and something that I'm finding more and more people need support with, and always happy to do that.
Just generally speaking, what does the evidence say around starting solids? And what are some of the
Yeah,
big myths or misconceptions that
totally.
you're supporting people with?
Okay, I would say like the biggest myth, and I feel like it's a lot of like family, no shade to the family doctors because they're great, but the biggest myth is that your kid, if they start solids early and they're eating lots of food, that they'll sleep through the night. And I'm
Mm.
sorry to break it to you, but that is just not the case. Like those 2 teaspoons of applesauce puree is not going to make them sleep through the night. Like the biggest thing is, I think, building the intuition as a parent of like, these are the signs of readiness. And this is like when in your gut, like your kid will show you when they're ready, and they will show you when they're hungry. They will show you when they're full, just like they did when they first started to learn to like nurse or bottle feed. Is they show you their hunger and fullness cues, and it's still trusting those intuitions and those signs even when they're starting solids. And I think, of course, like as parents, if you're having, going through the sleep regression, you're grasping at straws to find that solution to sleep. Unfortunately, it's not solids that is going to make them sleep through the night. There's a lot of different things that go into sleep and development at that age. But
Mhm.
just because they eat solids, especially if they're not ready, it doesn't make a difference with their sleep. So I think
Mhm.
that's like probably the biggest myth that I
So
hear a
some,
lot.
yeah, I bet. So some families are almost pushing that earlier as a solution
Totally. And
to
like
sleep, and then if
almost,
they're not ready, then that'd be another challenge, I'm sure. Yeah.
yeah. And like almost like given as medical advice. Like I've heard people tell me, and whether that was like their medical provider that gave them that advice, or whether that was like misunderstood or something, like there's been multiple occasions where I've heard that from parents where it's come from their medical provider, that if you just start solids early, they'll sleep better.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Okay. And
big
so,
myth.
yeah, so what would be some signs then that it is too early? They're just rejecting the
Yeah,
food
they're
and
not having good, like, they're not sitting up. So the difference, like, some kids at like 4 to 6 months, there's going to be a huge range of like kids that have good head control, good trunk control. They can sit supported, they're tracking a spoon. If you're like 4 month old is nowhere near sitting their head up and having that, a little bit more independence with sitting, like they're not ready to eat. And it's in fact like not
mm,
safe to keep eating to try that. They're just not ready. And that's okay. They'll show
right.
you when they're ready.
Yeah,
Yeah. So the
that makes
variation
sense.
I find between like 4 to 6 months, it can be a huge difference for a lot of kids. So That's
Yeah.
one of the biggest signs. And yeah, the it'll often be it's like a reflex where kids will often like spit things out, and that's a protective mechanism. Babies that are not ready to start solids, they will spit things out of their mouth that are potential choking hazards. So often it'll be like a really, really strong gag reflex. And sometimes parents can interpret that as like their kids like totally rejecting food, or they have an oral aversion, when actually it's just that's a protective mechanism, is they are not meant to be eating right now, so they're spitting it out, and that's totally okay. And that gag reflex tends to soften and like get less and less like pronounced as they're developing, getting more and more ready for solids.
Super interesting. And so,
So
speaking of
interesting.
the gag reflex and choking, I'm sure, correct me if I'm wrong, but is that fear of choking really common as parents are starting solids or trying to start solids?
Super common, really, really common. Yeah, because it's like this very nerve-wracking
Yeah.
hazard that you are providing to them as a parent, and their gag reflexes, especially when they first start, can be very loud and pronounced. So yes, that fear of choking is so real. And so I always recommend families, if that is a challenge for them, is like take a first aid course. They're like take an infant CPR course, take a first aid course, whether it's like an online refresher or something local that you can do. Practice taking your kid in and out of a high chair really quickly. Watch them and supervise them and really talk about the signs to build that confidence. And I also always like frame it as like, yes, they could choke on food, but they also could choke on a rock or like put something else in their mouth, or kids leaving Lego out. Like there is going to be so many hazards that could potentially end up in their mouth. Sometimes it's food, sometimes it's not. So whatever building confidence looks like for them, is really, really helpful in getting started, and so common for families to feel pretty nervous.
Yeah. So are we, and by we I mean just as a society, worrying about this more than necessary, or like what does the research say around choking? Like, is it actually that common?
Yeah, I don't know what the actual stats are. Like, the difference between baby led weaning, so starting with more like solid, chunkier foods, and purees, there isn't a statistical difference between choking on those two methods versus puree versus baby led weaning, with the caveat that with baby led weaning, we're offering the appropriate size texture for that age and stage. So anything like small and round, like a whole blueberry or a whole pea, that wouldn't be recommended for an infant, whether regardless of where they're at. And so knowing like what are those common choking hazards and how to avoid that is also part of the education that I provide. Yeah, I mean, it definitely can happen.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's sometimes things that can be like unexpected, like bread, for example, can be like really dry and kind of like globby. So it can kind of form a ball in their mouth. So anything that we can add lots of moisture to, and then a lot of education around what texture is appropriate and when, is what's helpful in reducing those risks.
That makes sense. Yeah, so
Yeah,
interesting. I can tell you're really
super
passionate about
interesting.
this topic, which is great. Yeah. So
Yeah, it's
starting
awesome.
solids is one common one that you work
Yeah,
with. What are some others?
yeah,
Maybe two, I think you mentioned you would
yeah,
talk about three. So yeah, hit
yeah.
us with two others.
Picky eating is kind of like twofold, I would say. There's sort of like your expected picky eaters. Like there is a age and stage where we expect some sort of pickiness, and that's usually from like our toddler phase to that like early childhood or early preschool phase. Some of that's developmental, but it's kind of how do we address that as parents, and how do we move through that as parents that help kind of bridge that like framework in helping them incorporate some more variety and selection in the future. So there's an age and stage where it's totally, par for the course. We're picky eating. And as a dietitian, I'm supporting parents and like, what are we doing in that realm? And so a lot of that is like, what does a division of responsibility look like, which is a common feeding framework that we use for kids, of what's a parent's responsibility and what's a kid's responsibility, and what does that actually look like when we're practicing that in the home. So I'm really going through the examples of what that's looking like, and it's trying to build confidence that Sometimes there's a little of these like short term solutions of like maybe if I put the TV on and distract them and feed them an extra bite, or maybe if I bribe them with a chocolate cookie that they'll eat that extra bite of broccoli. And what the evidence says around that, like, yes, in the moment they ate that extra bite of broccoli, but in the long run, we could be, creating something that is not the desired outcome. So it's really kind of putting into perspective what's our short term goals and what's our long term goals and what are we looking for and what does that look like for your kid, for your family. So I'll say that's a pretty like common thing I'm chatting with families about. And then I'll also get through the, kids that are in elementary school, middle school, that parents were super, super chill with. They were like, yeah, we just thought it was a picky eating phase and they never grew out of it. And they're like, how do I then encourage them and support them with trying new foods and incorporating, more fruits and vegetables, or incorporating different types of food, helping them feel more confident about eating at a restaurant or a birthday party, for their kiddo that has kind of grown out of that expected picky eating phase. And so coming up with like some really, really specific strategies of what makes sense for that family and what makes sense for that kid. Because sometimes, yeah, a lot of the times it's like we just think they're going to grow out of it and it doesn't happen. So it's like, now what do we do? And that's a totally kind of different conversation than our typical toddler picky eater.
And are there any signs this is something they might not grow out of? Are there any
Mm.
early warning signs of that at all?
Yeah. So the common thing is like we always want to offer what we call like safe foods or accepted foods. So we always want to offer accepted foods alongside like our family meals. So if parents want to eat like spaghetti and meatballs and a side of Caesar salad or something, and their kid doesn't like sauce, they don't like meatballs, so you give them some like plain noodles or something modified with that. That would be like a good example of the division of responsibility where like we're making modifications, we're making things happen. Where I think a lot of families get stuck is like, okay, my kid's a picky eater. I know they're not going to eat the stir fry or lasagna or anything that I'm making tonight. So I'm going to make them a grilled cheese instead, or I'm going to make them chicken nuggets instead. And they get into this short order cook situation where they're just making two separate meals. And as a kid, we can't expect them to try new food if we're not giving them the opportunity to try new food. So we can't expect them to be trying that like stir fry or lasagna or some family food that we've made if we're just always kind of doing that set short order cook. We're just giving them the default meal because we know or we are pretty confident that they're not going to try something. So it's reframing like how are we making that modification? Like how are we sort of bridging that in between? How are we modifying the meal that we want them to have and slowly making really small adjustments to try to engage them and entice them into eating something new and include them in part of that process, as opposed to just always assuming that they just want the chicken nuggets and fries or something. And I'll say this process looks really different for every family, and it looks really different for like a neurotypical kid versus a neurodivergent kid. And so it's a really individualized approach, but those would be kind of some of the things I'd be picking up on first. Like, okay, if we're always kind of giving them that short order cook, that default meal, is we're not giving them the opportunity to try something. So how do we build in those opportunities? And it's giving parents the expectations as well. Is like for some kids, they may need to be exposed to food like 20, 30 times before they're willing to interact with that. So before they're willing to say like poke it or touch it or smell it or lick it or chew it and spit it out. 20 to 30 times, which is a lot. Like if you think about one specific food item, you're like, do I eat peas 20 to 30 times in 1 month? So you have to be kind of really mindful of like how often we're giving those exposures. And then potentially for a neurodivergent kid, that might look like 200 times they need to be exposed to something before willingness to interact with it. And just because they do interact with it and try it doesn't mean that's like in the repertoire of the accepted foods now. So it's really building those expectations with family of like, okay, if we're on the picky eating track, whatever that's looking like, is it's not something that changes overnight. I don't have a magic switch to just be like, all of a sudden they're going to be eating all of these new foods, but here's some of the strategies to try. And also looking at their nutrition assessment of like, which things are we prioritizing? Because the priority is really, really in the context of like, how is their specific nutrition status? If they're eating lots of fruits, maybe a couple veg, maybe our priority is like, okay, can we find some protein foods? Just depending on each kiddo, the nutrition assessment and the priorities will be really different. Yeah,
I
it's
think
a
that's
really,
so important for people
yeah,
to know how many times it takes. Like 20 to 30 already feels like a
yes,
lot, but for a
it's so
neurodivergent
much.
child, 200, because I'm sure, I can only imagine as a parent, it's like, okay, well, this, you try it a few times and it's just a big fight. And
Yes.
it's like, it's just, this is never going to happen. So it's not worth the battle. But even knowing how many times it could take, that can give some validation and some encouragement, I'm
Totally.
sure, to keep going. And it's not a failure on your part. It's just the nature of
Yeah.
how these things go. Yeah. And I really like the example of the pasta. And I'm sure how, yeah, if, you're not even giving the child the opportunity to get used to the food and just replacing it right away, finding a modification, like what is it about the pasta they don't like versus just
Mhm.
ruling it out altogether, right?
Totally. I would say, like, as a parent and parenting these days, like, oftentimes we have like two working parents that are juggling a lot of other things on their plate. So, taking the time to invest in these like extra steps, extra things can feel very, very daunting. And so, a lot of times
Sure.
I'm like giving that accountability and support of like, okay, what is realistic for your family? Can we do this once a week, two times a week, three times a week? To really build that into a schedule that makes sense for them because often there's just so many other priorities that are on our
Of
plates these days
course.
as parents. So
And
giving
finite
yourself
amounts of
grace.
energy, finite amounts of
Yes.
energy too, I'm sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And parents hold a lot of guilt on how their kids
Yeah.
eat. They hold a lot of guilt and shame if their kid isn't eating a specific way or maybe feel judged. Around what their kid is eating. And so it's really normalizing that as well and validating like that this is nothing that you could have done or changed or prevented. Like this is just kind of part of human nature and that's totally normal. And how can we move this forward? And how can I support you in moving that forward? And it's not an overnight switch. So it's a lifelong thing.
Yeah. And could you give, well, I'm sure it looks very different from child to child, but specifically for neurodivergent children that are picky
Hmm.
eaters, could you speak or maybe provide some examples of strategies that you've seen in your
Hmm.
practice for these people specifically?
Yeah, yeah. Sometimes I might focus more on like what does regulation look like before the meal times in general because if a kid is really dysregulated before eating and their nutrition isn't optimized, like there can be a lot of just overstimulation when we're at mealtime. And so if we're starting off at a place that is like really, really dysregulated, then it's really hard to, put something in that's challenging, say that's like a newer food or a newer texture. Um, in front of them that could be super challenging if they're already feeling dysregulated and uncomfortable. So, how do we build regulation in before mealtime is something that often we'll be chatting about with families. I would say for older kids, like neurodivergent kids, is sometimes it's the kids bringing it forward. If they're the youth, they're like, I saw my friend eating this and I really want to try that or I want to eat healthier. They have something that's like prompted them to do that and trying to get having their collaboration on what is comfortable for them is really, really important because as someone who is a nutrition expert and saying like, XYZ is important, you have to eat like a green vegetable, a red vegetable, or whatever. Just because I've told them that's important doesn't mean that's going to happen. But if it's especially like a older teen, having their collaboration and their buy-in of what feels good for them or what feels comfortable for them in the really specifics of like how many times, when, what meal, who's going to be with you, what do you want to serve it, can just really help give some empowerment to kids and involved in that feeding aspect too. So sometimes that can process can look different for a neurodivergent kid.
Yeah, and so
Yeah.
what would be some strategies around regulation at meal?
Yeah. So it totally depends on the kid. Sometimes it's like really building in the schedule beforehand and preloading the expectation around a mealtime. So we might build up like visual timers or visual schedules of like, okay, we're gonna sit down at the table in 10 minutes, we're gonna sit down at the table in 5 minutes, in 2 minutes. This is what's gonna be on dinner tonight. This is what's going to be on the plate so that they're not feeling, nervous or surprised like when that food is there. Sometimes if it's like, okay, this food might smell really strong, is like, can we eat outside? Can we eat somewhere that has like more airflow or windows, just so that sensory component isn't overstimulating? Remember with one kid, I telling the parent, I was like, she seemed to always really need to have a lot of like physical input and was really like physically seeking stimulation before eating and stuff. And that part of her routine was like jumping on the trampoline before eating, just to kind of calm her body and calm her nervous system down. And she was like, I don't know what it was. And I can't remember like too many of the specifics, but it was like such a niche thing that we had just sort of chatted about. She was like, yeah, I was really thinking about getting a trampoline for her. I kind of have this like gut feeling that this would work. And I was like, you know what? I was thinking that too. I think that would be a really great option. For some reason, it somehow, just really became a part of that routine. Some kids really do need that routine.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so what would be the third common area that you work on with families?
Yeah, I would say sometimes like I'll work with families on just like bridging everything together. So sometimes I'll have a parent who's like, I have just learned all of these things, or like a parent might be like, my husband just got diagnosed with high cholesterol and we've been really trying to incorporate more eating. But then I have a kid that has this allergy, and I have a kid that's super picky, and I have a kid that has this needs with eating or like sensory components. And how do I put all of that together? Because oftentimes like there can be a certain kid or a certain person that's like working on has some really really specific nutrition issues, whether that's allergy or what have you. And then as a parent you're like, okay, well I have 5 other kids that I need to cook with, and there's all these other people that are relying on me to cook and feed them. So how do I actually implement that in practice? So I'd call that kind of like family planning or just family nutrition. And sometimes that can look different for everyone, but it is something that I think just, takes things of like the concept or the theory or the recommendations that someone has, and how are we putting that into practice for a person. And so helping families feel part of that process is really important. Like I find that, family meal planning, I would say umbrella has been really nice to kind of tie everything together for everyone of how do we implement this for the entire family that works.
Where would you even begin with that? That seems so overwhelming. I'm stressed just
Yeah,
thinking about it. Yeah.
it's a lot of like Venn diagrams of like, okay, what works for everyone here? What are the accommodations that we need to make outside of this? And sometimes I was talking about like really, really specifics of someone's week. I'm like, if there's, gymnastics and swimming lessons and soccer practice on Monday, that doesn't sound like a day you're going to be cooking. So, like, what is our plan there? Is that the day that we have something in the freezer, or everyone has something that's like a totally deconstructed meal, like a pasta salad bar or sushi bar, where it's like everyone, or build your own pizzas or something, where you're like, I know there's toppings and there's something for everyone here. We don't have to, be doing a really elaborate meal. Everyone can kind of make it themselves. This is what might work on like those types of nights. Or is that the day that you're like putting something in the instant pot or the slow cooker? And is there maybe 1 or 2 meals that meet the criteria for everyone in that like slow cooker category? So sometimes I'll like break it down of like, okay, this is the cooking method we might use on a Monday because it's so busy. This is the cooking method we might use on a Tuesday, and which recipes fit for the whole family under that category. So it's kind of thinking about meal planning very abstract. I think sometimes we'll think about meal planning as like your Sunday, cook all day, you cook the same meal for 5 days a week and have all these like perfectly curated Tupperwares of the same thing. But a lot of the times that doesn't work for families. And they're like, I don't like cooking like that. That just wouldn't work for us. I'm like, okay, what will? And we sort of go through building up like their capsule recipes and really putting into practice what would be like the most practical things based on their schedule for that. So that I find is really fun and creative because
Hmm.
people are like, okay, I actually think I could use this. As to a lot of times people will say, like, I want a meal plan. And I'm like, okay, what does that look like for you? Do you want to cook every single day? Do you want to cook once a day? Like, what does that look like? And so really
Yeah,
breaking it down.
I could see also just pulling from my conversation with Marilee too about body doubling
Yes.
and how, something like this would be, I mean, overwhelming for, I think, even the average person, but for somebody who's
Mhm.
neurodivergent, even just that cognitive energy of trying to like plan and figure out the week, and having someone like yourself actually like sit down and almost cognitively assist with, the
Totally.
planning and the organization, because it's, I think it's common when we feel overwhelmed. It's like it just goes to the back burner, and then we feel even more overwhelmed when the day comes and we don't know what we're cooking and all of that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, so it's a really, I find that piece, like when we get it. It's so great to like put it all into use, and building a process that works for someone or someone's family is, yeah, building up that process, and that's going to look different for everyone. So I find that fun to do.
Yeah, and that's not something I would ever even think about a dietitian could support with. So it's really great to hear all of these things, because none of them really, even for myself being in healthcare, none of these things that you've gone through have really been the top things that I would think a dietitian
Totally.
would support with. So it's really great. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Any other thoughts or things that you commonly work with, or myths or
Yeah.
misconceptions around pediatric nutrition that you think would be important
Hmm.
to share?
Yeah, I see like most of the time, like I'm working with parents if they're 12 and under. Pretty much I'm working directly with parents because we really want to frame parents as like the experts of their child and their family's nutrition and eating.
Mhm.
And sometimes that often like kids will learn about nutrition through eating with their family and what their family role models. Sometimes there is this misconception of like they just need to hear it from someone else. They just need to hear a dietitian or an expert tell them what's healthy and what's not. And maybe for it really just depends on the kid, but oftentimes for younger kiddos, especially 12 and under, is like their parents are really their role models and trusted person that we want to help them navigate nutrition, especially in the world of social media where there is a lot of nutrition misinformation and kids accessing social media at younger ages. And we know that there is such a connection between nutrition but also our body image, and some of that misinformation online is we really want to build up is like their parents are the experts, and that parent is the one that should be going towards trusted information. So I'm often like coaching a lot of parents on like what those conversations look like. Sometimes for an older teen, a more mature like teen or kiddo can have conversations with them around eating and nutrition alongside a parent, just depending on what the topic is, especially if it's someone like a 13-year-old with a new diagnosis of celiac. Like they're kind of learning what that is and what that means for them. And so, totally appropriate to have those conversations alongside a parent. If it's a parent that's like, I'm maybe concerned about my kids' behavior around eating, whether that's they are maybe skipping certain meals, or maybe they are like sneaking foods, or you're noticing that they're like hiding foods or doing things, is oftentimes we'll have that conversation totally separate from the kid. It'll just be the parent and myself, just so I can totally chat about what candidly about all of the information, and if it makes sense to bring in a kid later, then we have that conversation. But a lot of times, yeah, I'm working with parents, which is cool.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point around making the parent the authority and
Yeah.
trusted figure, because I'm sure if that's outsourced, you're not going to be there most of the time. And so
Absolutely.
you want that carryover to whoever is in the household.
Yes,
Yeah.
for sure.
It makes a lot of sense. Awesome. Well, great tips. I don't have children yet myself, but I'm taking notes for the future. So
Of course.
thank you so much, Lawren, for joining
Awesome.
us. If people want to get in touch with you, how can they connect?
Yeah. Yeah. We have Instagram. So we're at Spuds Nutrition. We have a website, www.littlespudsnutrition.com. Through our you can contact us through there, or Instagram or Facebook, Spuds Nutrition as well. And any of those channels would be a great way to get in touch.
That's great. Well, I'll share that also in the show
Cool.
notes so
Sounds
that
good.
people can easily access. Well, thank you so much. And thanks everyone for
Yeah.
listening and tuning in to another episode of TMI Tuesdays. And again, this was part 2 of our series with Little Spuds. So if you missed it, please check out part 1 with Marilee Pumple, where we chat a little bit more about adults and neurodivergent affirming nutrition care and also eating disorders. So thanks to you both. Again, these were great conversations, and it's so awesome to hear about your different areas of expertise and also how you've bridged it all together at Spuds. So I think it's amazing to be able to support people through the lifespan. So thanks for
Awesome.
doing what you're doing.
Thanks for having us. It's been really fun.
Great. Okay, well, I hope everyone has a good rest of your week, and we'll see you again next Tuesday. Bye. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of TMI Tuesdays. Women's health is complex, nuanced, and deserves better conversations. If this episode resonated with you, I would absolutely love if you followed and subscribed to the podcast on Spotify and shared it with someone who might need to hear it. We'll see you again next Tuesday.